Hey, what's up everyone? So this is going to be the 71st opening that I'd like to share with you, which is the rotated snake opening. So this opening is typically initiated by black when he faces a diagonal opening. So this is the typical sequence. We start off with f5 as black, the typical start off. White goes to f6, diagonal opening. You jump into the usual cross-shaped centralization. And over here, out of these 9 moves that you can choose from, previously in the first couple of diagonal opening videos we covered on the buffalo opening and its variations, and over here right now we're moving on to c4 move, which is the rotated snake. So f7 is actually the snake variation, and of course if you're playing the equivalent kind of symmetrical or mini symmetrical or diagonally symmetrical move against, it's more like a rotated snake. So that's probably where it gets its name from, and it's the c4 move over here. So usually, when black, or if you choose to play this move c4 against diagonal, typically I see most response going to g5 if the person doesn't know the book. If the person knows the book, maybe f4, but seldom you see that many variations to the top. So that is something to think about, and probably it makes it relatively predictive or predictable. So I think G4 also appears occasionally. So let's talk about F4 variation first. So typically, if you play F4, if your opponent plays F4, your response would be either C6 or E7. Comparing these two, I think the rating doesn't really differs that much, and it's fairly intuitive for you to want to form a compact shape or cut into the center. So the response is generally quite easy for black. I personally prefer or think that e7 might be easier to play because it creates more chances of mistakes. Because um, white usually chooses maybe d7 to cut into the center. If white chooses f7, which is the so-called better move, you can then play the c6 move and allow white to jump in, and you can jump into d7. So after black jumps into d7, the typical response from white is to probably play e4. Seldom you see c8 being played, but if c8 were to be played, you can then just give up the edge and then jump into the center. And this kind of sequence makes it easy to play, but fairly counterintuitive for white to probably consider b6 perhaps, or maybe even g4. So the idea here is to feed the edge and jump into the space that is created against this mini diagonal over here for this sequence. Another option is that if white were to go into e8 immediately, then you can just jump into this pocket of space that white has kind of unlocked here. So it's still fairly intuitive for black. And if white knows the book and jumps into this, then simply you can just jump into the center over here, or even create this situation whereby black, white, black. So you give up the pocket space and you kind of penetrate. So 1, 2, 3 squares are connected. You basically play b4, almost like a mid-game parity. You feed off b5 and you jump into c7 as a centralizing move, perhaps, or you just immediately centralize. So I think it's still fairly intuitive for black to play. And of course, if white somehow chooses to play the head and tail theory on the back end or d3, then he basically opens up this lane and you can kind of counter with the head and tail theory of your own. This being the head and this being the tail end, it basically opens up a quiet move for you. So it's fairly intuitive for black to follow up. Or you could just jump into the pocket and centralize. So I would say that this opening is good to create a bit of a variation against your opponent who might be playing diagonal, and this is probably one of the more rare response to the diagonal opening. So you do give up quite a bit of an advantage. I think it might be a -6 opening perhaps to begin with. And in general, I would say it's difficult to follow up if your opponent really knows the book really well. So you have to really go deep in order to give yourself a good or fair opportunity. So assuming if white jumps into g5, you can do the same thing over here pocket. This wouldn't be as nice as a move as compared to the earlier variation to f4 for white, is because now that white plays g5, if you play e7, f4 becomes an excellent move for white to jump in and centralize because of the difference in shape. But earlier on, when f4 was taken, this is fine because it doesn't present a good move for white to the top. So if white plays g5, it kind of narrows your options to c6. You have to follow up with c6. And of course, white would probably jump into c5 or maybe even b6. So I think the most common response here is c5. And if white goes c5, you can go either b6 or d7. I think d7 is probably more frequently played, and typically I think I would also go that one if I were to play this variation perhaps. And white could then go either, I think the more popular options would be e7, it's almost always, and not so much on c7 or b6 as much, but seems like the rating looks about the same. So typically white goes here, and then you can play just like a checkerboarding. So you checkerboard this line and you also checkerboard this line. So you form a situation whereby it's kind of loud, but white doesn't have a direct access to cut back into the center. So this is probably good because it creates back this access to cut into the center. But of course, black would then be able to go to the center of his own as well. So that's why this is the best move, whereby white has to cut away this particular disc in order to remove the access for black to jump into f4. So over here, after white plays this kind of relatively loud move, then as black, you pretty much want to just pick up a quiet move, maybe b5 or h5, both are vertical cuts, horizontal cuts. This one is probably a little harder to explain, but maybe the potential objective is to capture the d6 disc so that you can jump into f4, given that it's quite loud, perhaps. But this is also preventable. Yeah, but maybe, I guess, this diagonal cut presents itself as one more opportunity to jump in to regroup over here. So I think this still gives black quite a bit of opportunity to variate. So yeah, go ahead and try this variation as kind of like a partial variation against the diagonal opening. So usually if you keep this as like a surprise opening, you might be able to throw your opponent a little off guard, but you definitely need to know how to follow up with that rotated snake variation. So thank you very much for joining me in this episode, and I'll see you at the next one. Goodbye.